When I walked into the courtroom that morning, the judge looked up from his papers, startled. He blinked, leaned forward, and whispered to the clerk, as if confirming something impossible. Then his voice broke the silence. "Why are you standing outside, Mrs. Hall?" It was meant as courtesy. But the truth was heavier. Because the last time I'd been in that courtroom, I wasn't standing outside. I was the one sitting in front, wearing the robe, delivering judgment. That was many years ago. Back when they called me the Queen of Law. Before I traded my courtroom heels for kitchen slippers. Before I became simply Eleanor Hall, mother, grandmother, and widow. That day, as I stood outside the bench, I wasn't here as a lawyer. I was here as something much smaller. A mother trying to protect what little was left of her family. But stories like mine don't begin in the courtroom. They begin at home. With warmth, laughter, and a love that made you forget how fragile peace can be. Before the accident, my son Thomas was a man who made me proud in every sense. He had my stubbornness, his father's steady kindness, and a smile that softened the hardest hearts. When he married Olivia, I thought life had given him everything. A wife who adored him, a little daughter named Sophie, and a home filled with the kind of laughter that makes the walls feel alive. I still remember the first time I held Sophie. She had Thomas's eyes, bright, curious, full of light. She wrapped her tiny fingers around my thumb, and I felt something I hadn't in years: purpose. I'd retired from law just a few months before she was born. After 30 years of cross-examinations, long nights, and countless verdicts, I thought I'd earned the right to rest. To bake bread. To tend roses. To let time pass without needing to measure it in case numbers and legal briefs. I sold my office. Donated half my suits. Told myself I was done fighting battles that didn't belong to me. But I never imagined the next one would. Thomas and Olivia were young, beautiful, and ambitious. They built a good life, a new house on Maple Street, a car Thomas washed every Saturday, a garden Olivia decorated with fairy lights. Every Sunday they'd come for dinner. Sophie would run in first, straight into my arms, while Olivia followed, carrying a bottle of wine and the smile she wore like expensive jewelry. I tried to love her. I truly did. But some people shine so brightly that it blinds you to what's beneath. And beneath Olivia's glow was something that always felt sharp. A hunger for more, a kind of beauty that wasn't content just being admired. I'd seen women like her before. In courtrooms. On witness stands. The kind who could make you doubt your own reflection if it served their cause. Till I said nothing. 'Cause Thomas was happy. And a mother's love often chooses silence over suspicion. It was a Tuesday when everything changed. The phone rang just after dawn. I remember because I was kneading dough for Sophie's favorite cinnamon rolls. The flour on my hands, the smell of butter. And then that voice. A man's voice. Calm but heavy. "There's been an accident. Thomas's car had been hit by a truck on the highway. He survived. But barely." The words came slowly after that: fractured spine, nerve damage, paralysis. I don't remember hanging up. I just remember the sound of the dough hitting the floor. Hospitals have their own kind of silence. It's not empty, it's heavy, like the air itself is waiting. Machines beep. Nurses whisper. You breathe because you have to, not because you want to. When I saw Thomas, I didn't see my son. I saw a body that looked like him, trapped in something smaller. His eyes searched mine, full of fear he didn't know how to say aloud. And Olivia. Oh, she was perfect. Tears at the corners of her eyes, a trembling voice, hands folded just so. To the world, she looked like the picture of a grieving wife. But to me, her sadness seemed rehearsed. 'Cause grief makes you crumble. And she was performing. Till I brushed the thought away. I told myself trauma changes people. That pain wears many faces. But even as I held my son's hand and whispered that everything would be all right, a quiet unease began to bloom inside me. The weeks after the accident blurred together, Hospital visits, physiotherapy sessions, insurance calls. Thomas's body healed slower than expected. His spirit even slower. He'd been the kind of man who fixed everything, and now he couldn't even hold a cup without shaking. I tried to stay strong. Cooked meals. Paid bills. Sat with him when the nights grew too long. And Olivia, she changed. At first, it was little things, sighs when nurses asked questions, impatience when Thomas couldn't move fast enough. Then came the avoidance, business trips that lasted days, nights spent with friends. Her perfume began to linger longer than her presence. I wanted to ask her what was wrong, but I already knew the answer, everything. She didn't marry a man who needed help. She married a man who made her feel adored. And now that adoration was gone. One evening, I found Thomas sitting by the window, staring at the rain. The house was too quiet. Olivia hadn't come home. Sophie was asleep upstairs, her small hand clutching the stuffed bear I'd given her. He didn't look at me when he spoke. He just said softly, "Mom, I think she wants to leave." And my heart broke twice that night, once for the man he was and once for the woman she'd never truly been. I should have seen it then, the pattern, the shift, the greed creeping in like slow poison. But grief clouds logic. Even a lawyer's mind forgets how to build a case when the evidence is love. So I stayed quiet. I told myself time would fix it. That marriage, like the law, needed patience. But life was already writing a verdict I hadn't prepared for. The next morning, I noticed something strange. A letter on the table, addressed to Olivia from a property firm. I shouldn't have looked. But I did. It was about our house, the one Thomas and Olivia shared. It mentioned sale proceedings, ownership dispute, and transfer rights. And at the bottom, I saw Olivia's signature. That night, when I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but the storm inside me hadn't. I thought of my son, broken, trusting, believing that love still lived where greed had already moved in. And I thought of my granddaughter, her laughter echoing down halls that might soon belong to someone else. That was the first night I pulled out my old briefcase. The one with my initials engraved, H. It had been gathering dust for years in the corner of my closet. When I opened it, the scent of old paper and ink hit me like a memory. Inside was my old courtroom badge, worn but gleaming faintly in the lamplight. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like someone's mother or someone's burden. I felt like who I used to be. They say mothers can move mountains. I don't know about mountains, but I do know this. When someone threatens your child, the law stops being theory. It becomes instinct. And as I sat there, tracing the edge of my old badge, I whispered to the night, I was done fighting. But now it's my turn again. There's a silence that comes after heartbreak, not loud, not dramatic, just heavy. It lingers in the corners of rooms and between words that should have been spoken. That's the kind of silence that filled our house after I found that letter. From the outside, everything looked the same. Curtains were still drawn neatly each morning. The smell of coffee still filled the kitchen. Sophie's laughter still echoed down the hall. But inside, everything had changed. When love begins to rot, it doesn't make a sound. It simply loses its warmth. Thomas was healing physically, but the man I'd known, my strong, steady boy, was slipping away. He spent hours staring at his hands, as if willing them to move the way they used to. His laughter had become rare, and when it came, it sounded fragile, like glass about to crack. Olivia was hardly home anymore. When she was, she drifted through the house like a guest who couldn't wait to leave. She wore new clothes, expensive ones. Her nails were always perfect, her phone always buzzing. And when she did speak, it was never to Thomas, it was about him. His therapy schedule. His medical bills. His limitations. As if his pain was an inconvenience she had to manage. I wanted to shout at her. To ask how she could be so cruel to a man who once built her a home with his own hands. But I stayed quiet. 'Cause sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is watch. And I was watching everything. It was Sophie who noticed first. Children sense what adults try to hide. She'd ask me questions in whispers. "Grandma, why is Daddy sad all the time? Why doesn't Mommy smile anymore?" I'd brush her hair, kiss her forehead, and tell her everything would be okay. But I was lying. I didn't believe it myself. One afternoon, I stopped by the house unannounced. Thomas was asleep in the recliner, a blanket half slid off his lap. TV was on but muted. I walked through the quiet rooms, noticing the small changes that speak louder than arguments. The framed wedding photo was gone from the mantel. The shelves were emptier, no family pictures, no signs of warmth. And in the corner of the dining room, a stack of envelopes with unfamiliar letterheads. I picked one up, a bank statement. Another, an insurance update. And then one that made my stomach twist. A property assessment for my home address. It was in Olivia's name. I sat down at the table, the papers spread out before me like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. Everything pointed to one truth: she wasn't just planning to leave. She was preparing to take everything with her. Not just the house. Not just the money. Even Sophie. That night I barely slept. I could hear the rain tapping against the window, steady, relentless. Kind of rain that sounds like time running out. The next morning, I went to visit Thomas again. He was pale, thinner than I remembered. His smile didn't reach his eyes. He told me Olivia had hired a lawyer, something about joint property and financial independence. He said it quietly, almost apologetically, as if it were his fault. That's when I knew. She'd already made her move. I drove home that day with the radio off. The streets blurred past me, gray and slick from the rain. My hands gripped the wheel, but my mind was somewhere else, back in those years I'd buried. The courtroom. Cases. The arguments. The woman I used to be before I softened my edges for motherhood. I remembered the thrill of it, the way truth could slice through lies if you asked the right question, the way silence in a courtroom could feel like justice waiting to be spoken. And I thought about how easily I'd forgotten that woman. How easily I'd let people see only Mom and Grandma instead of what I truly was. A fighter. A strategist. A woman who once knew how to turn chaos into order. That part of me had gone quiet. But not dead. In the days that followed, the cracks in Olivia's facade widened. She started avoiding me altogether. She'd drop Sophie off at my house for just a few hours and not return until midnight. She'd stop answering Thomas's calls. When she did speak to me, it was with a cold, practiced smile, the kind lawyers give when they've already written your verdict. I recognized it because I'd worn that same smile once. Then came the day I found her true intention. It was a Saturday morning. Sophie and I were coloring on the porch when Olivia pulled up in her new car, sleek, expensive, far beyond what their finances should allow. She walked up with a small envelope and a look that didn't bother pretending anymore. She handed it to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Inside were court documents, a petition for sole custody of Sophie, citing unsafe living conditions and emotional instability due to Thomas's disability. I could barely breathe. The edges of the paper trembled in my hands. It wasn't just betrayal, it was war. And suddenly everything made sense. The property transfers. The lies. Calculated distance. She wasn't just leaving, she was erasing us. That night I went into my study, the one I hadn't used in years. I opened the drawer and found my old law books, their spines cracked, their pages yellowing. I ran my fingers over the titles, remembering the cases I'd won, the clients I'd saved, the times I'd stood alone and unafraid. And something inside me woke up. It wasn't rage. It wasn't vengeance. It was purpose. The next morning, I visited Thomas. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders hunched under invisible weight. He told me Olivia had been speaking to her lawyer about selling the house, his house, He said he'd given up fighting it. That's when I realized how deep her cruelty had gone. She hadn't just broken his body, she'd broken his will. But she had forgotten one thing. When you destroy a man like that, you wake the woman who built him. That night, I sat at my desk, pen in hand, writing notes, marking names, making calls. It had been years since I'd drafted a motion, but my hands still remembered the rhythm, the structure, precision. And for the first time in a long while, I felt alive. 'Cause this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoring balance. I closed my eyes and saw Sophie's face. Her laughter. Her innocence. The way she said "Grandma" like it meant safety. And I whispered to myself, she's not taking this child. Not this time. I wasn't just preparing for a case. I was preparing for war, the kind fought with truth, patience, and quiet fire. Because I had learned something Olivia never would. You can play games with love, with money, with marriage, but never with a mother's heart. That night, I made a promise to Robert, my late husband, and to myself. If life wanted to drag me back into the courtroom I'd left behind, I would walk in not as a victim, but as the woman they once called the Queen of Law. The morning I discovered the truth, the world was deceptively peaceful. A soft breeze moved through the curtains, sunlight spilled across the floor, and for a moment I thought it might be an ordinary day. But some truths don't arrive with thunder. They arrive disguised as calm. It started with a phone call from the bank. The woman on the other end spoke politely, too politely. She asked if I could verify a few recent transactions from an account under my son's name. When she listed them, something inside me went cold. A property deposit, a trust transfer, and a payment to a law firm I knew all too well. That firm specialized in one thing, divorce and asset separation. I hung up slowly, the sound of my own breathing louder than the silence in the room. For a few minutes, I couldn't move. I just sat there, the phone still in my hand, as the last threads of denial unraveled around me. Olivia hadn't been preparing to leave. She'd already left, quietly, strategically, and with a lawyer's precision. All that was left now was the performance. I drove to Thomas's house without thinking. The driveway was empty. The blinds drawn. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator filled the air when I walked in. On the kitchen counter, I saw a stack of papers held down by a coffee mug. I didn't need to read them to know what they were. Till I did. Divorce petition. Custody claim. Said distribution proposal. Each page signed by Olivia. Each word phrased to make my son sound unfit, unstable, incapable. And there, in the section labeled custody of minor child, I read the sentence that stopped my heart. Primary care and residence to be awarded to the mother, due to father's physical and emotional incapacity. I stood there for what felt like forever, the weight of every betrayal pressing into my chest. It wasn't just a legal document. It was a declaration that love meant nothing, that loyalty was disposable, that my son's suffering was an opportunity to her. I went to Thomas's room. He was sitting in his wheelchair by the window, staring out at the garden. His shoulders were slumped. His hands rested in his lap, still and heavy. For a moment, I just watched him, my son, my boy, who used to chase sunlight barefoot through our yard, now trapped by the limits of a body he didn't deserve. He didn't notice me at first. When he did, he forced a smile, small, tired. "Mom," he said softly, "I think it's for the best." Those words broke something in me that I didn't know could still break. The best? He thought losing his child, his home, and his dignity was for the best. 'Cause that's what happens when someone you love convinces you you're worthless. I knelt beside him and took his hands, cold, trembling hands that once fixed everything I ever broke. He tried to pull them away, ashamed. He said he couldn't fight anymore, that he didn't want to make things uglier than they already were. But I knew the truth. Olivia had already made things ugly. She had taken the beauty of their life and buried it under greed. And for the first time in years, I felt anger, Not the loud, reckless kind, but the steady, bone-deep kind. Kind that builds like fire behind calm eyes. That night, I sat in my study and opened my old case files again. The smell of paper and ink was grounding, like touching a version of myself I'd left behind. Each folder, each note, each scribble in the margins reminded me who I was before I became just Mom. I read through Olivia's petitions again, this time not as a mother but as a lawyer. And beneath the elegant phrasing and false concern, I saw what she was hiding. Fabricated medical reports. Manipulated statements. A forged signature from a physical therapist who had never even met Thomas. It was a carefully crafted illusion, but I'd built and dismantled illusions for decades. And in that moment, the fog of grief lifted completely. This wasn't heartbreak anymore. It was preparation. Still, as I sat there surrounded by papers, my chest ached. Because beneath the strategy and the fury was still a mother who wished things had been different. Who wished Olivia had loved my son enough to stay when it got hard. Who wished that the laughter in that house hadn't turned into silence. But wishes are for people who still believe the world is fair. I didn't. I believed in justice, and I was done waiting for someone else to deliver it. The next day, I visited the courthouse for the first time in almost a decade. The security guard at the entrance smiled politely and asked for my ID. When he saw my old bar card still tucked inside my wallet, he looked up in surprise. "Didn't think you lawyers ever really retired," he said with a grin. I smiled back, but there was no humor in it. Some of us don't, I thought. Some of us just wait for the right fight. I walked the halls slowly, letting the familiar echo of my heels on the tile ground me. Every case I'd ever fought, every verdict I'd delivered, every plea I'd heard, they came rushing back. Not as ghosts, but as reminders. I wasn't here to remember who I was. I was here to use it. That evening, I went back to Thomas. He was quiet, distant, like someone waiting for the end. I told him I'd read the documents. He nodded, eyes wet, and said, "I don't want to drag this out, Mom. She'll win anyway." That's when I said something I hadn't planned. "You're right," I told him softly. "She will. If you fight her." He looked up, confused. Then I said the words that changed everything. "But she won't be fighting you." The days that followed were filled with late nights and quiet fury. I pulled every record, every medical report, every text message I could find. And what I found was enough to shatter whatever doubt I still had. She'd been moving money behind his back for months. She'd been corresponding with lawyers long before the accident. She'd even drafted a will, with Thomas's name forged beneath her own. It wasn't carelessness. It was a plan. A plan that began long before tragedy, and ended with her standing over the ruins of my son's life, ready to take the last thing he had left. And that's when I stopped feeling pain. 'Cause pain belongs to the powerless. And I was no longer powerless. That night, as the house grew still and the clock ticked quietly on the mantel, I stood by the window looking out at the dark. My reflection stared back, older, lined with years and sorrow, but steadier than ever. I remembered what one of my old mentors used to say. When people mistake your silence for weakness, you don't correct them. You let them walk into the courtroom thinking they've already won. I smiled faintly at the glass. Olivia had no idea who she was really fighting. And as the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I closed the file, sealed the documents, and whispered, "You wanted a war, Olivia. You found your general." The morning of the hearing was gray and still, the kind of morning that feels like the world is holding its breath. I left the house before sunrise, my briefcase tucked beneath my arm, the same one I had carried through 100 trials years ago. Felt strange to hold it again, yet oddly right, as though justice itself had been waiting in that old leather for me to come back. When I arrived, the courthouse loomed ahead, tall and unmoving against the sky. People moved in and out of its glass doors, unaware that inside my family's fate was about to be decided. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my life defending strangers. Now it was my turn to defend my own blood. As I stepped through security, one of the clerks recognized me. Her eyes widened slightly. "Mrs. Whitmore," she whispered. "I thought you'd retired." I gave her a faint smile. Just stepping in for one more case. But she didn't understand. This wasn't one more case. It was the case, the one that would decide whether my son lived the rest of his life as a father or as a broken man. Inside the courtroom, the air was sharp and cold. Olivia sat across the room, poised as ever, her lawyer whispering something to her that made her smirk. She didn't even look in my direction. I suppose she thought I was just there as moral support for Thomas, the weary mother of a man who'd already lost too much. I didn't correct her. Thomas sat quietly beside me. He looked small in his wheelchair, his shoulders tense, his eyes fixed on the floor. I reached over and placed my hand over his, the way I used to when he was a little boy afraid of storms. He squeezed it gently as if to say, "I trust you." And that was all I needed. When the judge entered, everyone stood. I hadn't seen Judge Reynolds in nearly 15 years, but his presence was as steady as ever, a man who valued truth more than procedure. He adjusted his glasses, glanced over the paperwork, and said the words that would stay with me forever. "Before we begin," he said, "I'd like to ask, why is Mrs. Whitmore standing outside the counsel's area? Are you representing your son or not?" The room went silent. Olivia's lawyer blinked, confused. I looked at the judge, smiled softly, and stepped forward. "With the court's permission, Your Honor," I said, "I will be representing my son, Mr. Thomas Whitmore, in this proceeding." A whisper rippled through the courtroom. Olivia's composure cracked, just slightly, her lips tightening as she turned toward me for the first time. She hadn't expected this. She thought the old woman she'd underestimated would sit quietly on the sidelines. She thought wrong. I began slowly, deliberately, allowing every word to land. I walked the court through Thomas's medical history, through the records of rehabilitation, through the timeline of Olivia's financial withdrawals. Each document I presented had a story behind it, and I told those stories with precision and calm. Her lawyer objected once, twice, then stopped. He realized that every piece of evidence I laid out was sealed in black and white, impossible to dismiss. Then came the forged documents, the false therapist's report, the altered prescription receipts. When I handed them to the clerk, Olivia's eyes widened just enough for me to see the truth in them. She had thought her cleverness would never be traced. But she had underestimated what a mother with purpose can find. At one point, I caught the judge's gaze. There was a flicker of something in his expression, recognition, perhaps admiration, or the faint memory of old respect. He had seen me argue countless cases years ago. He knew my methods. And now I could almost feel him piecing together the story without me having to say it aloud. When it was Olivia's turn, her voice trembled slightly. She spoke about sacrifice, about love turned cold, about how she had done her best. But the more she spoke, the more hollow her words sounded. They rang like a well-rehearsed script, brittle at the edges. I didn't interrupt. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth has its own gravity. It pulls lies apart, one thread at a time. Then, when it was time for closing arguments, I stood and faced the court. I didn't look at Olivia or her lawyer. I looked only at my son, the man who had lost so much, and the child I had once promised to protect from every storm. "Your Honor," I began softly, "my son isn't a broken man. He's a wounded one. There's a difference. And the wound he carries isn't from the accident, it's from betrayal. From being told that the family he built wasn't worth standing beside when things became difficult." I paused, letting the silence speak for me. "You've seen the evidence. You've read the lies. I won't stand here and ask for pity or even fairness. I'll only ask for truth. 'Cause truth doesn't just belong to lawyers or judges. It belongs to the people who've been silent for too long." When I finished, the room was still. Even Olivia's lawyer avoided her gaze. The judge leaned back, exhaled slowly, and then said quietly, This court will recess for deliberation." We stepped out into the hallway. Thomas looked pale but lighter somehow, as though the air had changed. He whispered, "Mom, how did you know what to do?" I smiled faintly. "Because I've seen greed wear every mask," I said. "And I've seen love survive every wound." He looked at me then, tears glistening in his eyes, and for the first time since the accident, I saw my son again. Not the broken shell, but the man who once believed in hope. When we were called back in, the judge's tone was firm. He ruled in Thomas's favor, custody awarded to him, assets frozen pending investigation of fraud, and a separate inquiry into Olivia's actions. Each word fell like the toll of a quiet bell, measured and final. Olivia didn't look at me as she left. She just gathered her things, her steps quick, her composure cracking with every breath. But I didn't feel joy. Just a long, slow exhale of something I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Grief, maybe. Relief. Or both. 'Cause justice doesn't erase pain. Just gives it somewhere to go. Later that evening, after the courthouse had emptied and the world outside had resumed its rhythm, I sat on the courthouse steps. The light was fading, the air cooling around me. A few leaves danced across the concrete, catching in the wind. And I thought about all the years I'd spent away from this place, believing I'd left the fight behind. But maybe we never leave the parts of ourselves that are meant for battle. Maybe we just wait until something or someone we love enough calls us back into the arena. I looked up at the courthouse once more, and for the first time in a long while I didn't feel small or tired. I felt steady. I felt complete. And somewhere deep inside I heard the echo of my late husband's voice, the one that used to calm me after every trial. He used to say, "Eleanor, justice isn't about winning. It's about remembering who you are when the world tries to make you forget." I smiled at the memory. 'Cause today I remembered. That night, when Thomas wheeled himself into the living room and handed me a cup of tea, he said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you." I shook my head. "Don't," I whispered. "Just live a life that doesn't need saving again." He nodded, his eyes full of something softer than words, understanding. Gratitude. Love. And as the rain began to fall against the windows, gentle and rhythmic, I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me. Not the sound of defeat or vengeance, but of closure. Of a mother who had done what she must, not out of anger but out of love. 'Cause that's what love really is in the end. Not sacrifice without limit. Not forgiveness without truth. But the courage to fight for what's right, even when your hands are shaking. It's been 6 months since that day in court, 6 long months since I stood before the judge and remembered what it felt like to be both a mother and a lawyer again. Life has a strange way of softening after the storm. The air feels lighter now, though not quite clean. Some wounds, I've learned, don't heal, they just stop bleeding. Thomas is learning to walk again with braces, slow and deliberate. Every small step he takes feels like a sunrise, hesitant but real. His daughter, little Lily, has begun smiling again. I hear her laughter echo through the house, bouncing off the walls that once only carried the sound of silence. It's the kind of laughter that reminds you why you fought in the first place. As for me, I'm tired, but it's a good kind of tired, the kind that comes after you've done what your heart demanded, no matter the cost. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings, I still find myself replaying that day. The look on Olivia's face when she realized she'd lost, not just in court but in the eyes of the very people she once fooled. But there's no triumph in those memories, only stillness. 'Cause justice, when it finally comes, doesn't roar. It whispers. I could have ruined her completely. The evidence I uncovered could have ended her career, her reputation, her freedom. But when the district attorney asked if I wanted to pursue charges, I said no. Not because I forgave her, but because I finally understood something deeper, that revenge, no matter how righteous, always leaves a shadow behind. I didn't want to live in that shadow. Thomas asked me once, quietly, if I ever regretted stepping back into that courtroom. I told him the truth. I said no. But I regret the years I spent being afraid of who I used to be. For so long I had hidden my strength behind the label of mother, as if motherhood meant I had to shrink, to soften, to forget the woman who once stood tall in heels before a jury and made the truth tremble. But that day, the day the judge asked why I was standing outside, I remembered who I was before fear disguised itself as peace. Now the house feels alive again. I spend my mornings tending to the small garden out back, where Thomas built a wooden bench beside the roses. The roses are stubborn, they bloom even when the soil is dry, even when the wind tears at them. I suppose I am a little like that too. Lily likes to help me water them. She says each flower looks like a tiny crown, and maybe she's right. Maybe each one is a crown for every woman who has had to rise again after being broken, every mother who has fought her battles quietly, and every heart that learned to forgive itself for surviving. Sometimes I think of Olivia. Last I heard, she moved out of the city, living with her sister somewhere near the coast. She's alone, I imagine, maybe still angry, maybe lost. And I wonder if she ever realized that what she tried to take from us was something she could never own: family. 'Cause family isn't just shared blood or a shared roof. It's trust. It's sacrifice. And it's the quiet strength that stands up even when everyone else walks away. I pray for her sometimes. Not for reconciliation, but for clarity. Because clarity is the first step toward redemption, and I've seen how easily a person can lose themselves in their own reflection. The other day, I found one of my old law journals buried in a drawer. Pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but when I turned them, I felt that familiar rhythm again, the hum of logic, the heartbeat of truth. I closed the book and smiled. I didn't need those words anymore. I had lived them. I never returned to practice after that case. Instead, I began volunteering at a small legal aid center, helping women who don't have anyone to stand for them, women who are told to stay quiet, to be patient, to forgive before they've even been heard. And every time I help one of them, I see a little of myself in their eyes. That mixture of pain and pride, of exhaustion and defiance. It's a look that says, I've been hurt, but I'm still here. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the trees, Thomas came out with Lily. She was holding a crumpled drawing, a stick figure family, 3 smiling faces holding hands under a crooked sun. She pressed it into my hand and said, "Grandma, this is us. Daddy said you're the reason we're happy again." I couldn't speak for a moment. I just looked at the picture, at the unsteady lines and the innocent joy in them, and I felt something inside me finally settle. Not pride. Not relief. Just peace. The kind of peace that doesn't come from winning, but from knowing you did what was right when no one else would. That night, as I turned off the lights and walked down the hallway, I paused outside Thomas's room. I could hear him laughing softly with Lily. The sound was faint, but it filled every empty space in me that grief had once claimed. I whispered a quiet thank you to God, to time, to the version of myself who refused to stay silent. 'Cause silence is not kindness. And forgiveness is not surrender. They are choices meant to be made from strength, not fear. I know the world sees women like me as relics, old, sentimental, better off fading quietly into the background. But if only they knew how much power rests in the hands that once wiped away tears, in the hearts that still choose to hope after heartbreak. We are not relics. We are archives, full of stories, of lessons, of truths that refuse to disappear. So when people ask me what it felt like to stand in that courtroom again, I tell them this. Felt like remembering the sound of my own heartbeat. Felt like stepping out of the shadows and back into my name. And I suppose that's what justice really is. Not revenge, not victory, but remembrance. Of who we were before the world tried to make us small. As I sit here now, the night is quiet. The lamp beside me hums softly, and the tea in my cup has gone cold. Outside, I can see the moon catching on the window glass, calm, deliberate, whole. And for the first time in years, I don't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. 'Cause peace, I've learned, isn't given. It's earned, one truth at a time. I close my eyes, breathe in the stillness, and let the weight of everything fall away. The fear, the anger, the sorrow. All of it. And somewhere deep inside, I hear that voice again, quiet, steady, certain. Sometimes heartbreak isn't punishment, it's protection. And this time, I finally believe it. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks, so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.